Statistically speaking, the Wild West wasn't quite as wild as Hollywood might make you believe. Sure, there were quick-draw duels and rattlesnake bites, but if you really want to know what killed the most people out on the frontier, it wasn't bullets, it was the cold. The winters of the American frontier were merciless. Imagine waking up with your water bucket frozen solid inside the cabin, frost creeping down the walls like icy fingers, and the wind howling so loudly you couldn't even hear yourself think. That wasn't some nightmare, it was daily reality for families trying to survive on the prairie. And while we might sit cozy today under heated blankets, convinced we could tough it out, the truth is, most of us wouldn't last a week. Temperatures plunged to 40 below zero, blizzards struck without warning, and even your own sweat could kill you if it froze against your skin. Families burned buffalo dung for heat, slept packed together with their livestock, and rationed food so carefully that children grew up counting potatoes like gold coins. For them, survival wasn't about heroics, it was about preparation, adaptation, and sometimes sheer stubbornness. Yes, you would have died in the Wild West winter. But before we dive into the frostbitten realities of frontier life, make sure you're subscribed to the Sleepy Historian tonight. Trust me, you don't want to miss more stories of grit and survival from a world that tested humanity in ways we can barely imagine today. Drop a comment to tell us where you're listening from. Who knows, maybe you're hearing this under summer sun in New Zealand, while I'm about to plunge you into a Dakota blizzard in 1885. So bundle up, partners. The storm's rolling in, and it's going to get cold. The first sensation was not sight or sound, but pain. Imagine opening your eyes in a cabin on the Dakota Plains in the mid-1880s. Darkness presses against every corner, but you hardly notice it, because your eyelashes are frozen together. Not figuratively, literally crusted shut with ice. You pry them apart with stiff fingers that refuse to obey, each movement slow and clumsy, as if your joints have turned to glass. The simple act of blinking feels like peeling bark from a tree. Your breath escapes in a small cloud that hovers above your face for a second before crystallizing mid-air. A single tear leaks down your cheek, only to harden into a frozen pearl before it can fall. Even the moisture in your nose has seized, needles of ice scraping at every breath. It feels like inhaling razor blades. Welcome to winter on the American frontier, where the cold is not a season but a predator, waiting at the door, waiting in your very lungs. Outside, the temperature has plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. Inside, the log walls are so thin and riddled with cracks that they may as well be made of parchment. The wind shrieks through every seam, rattling the boards, making the cabin groan like a ship caught in a storm. The air doesn't just seep in, it assaults you, determined to root out whatever fragile warmth remains, and it always wins. Eventually, you lie buried under every piece of fabric your family owns. Quilts patched from scraps, winter coats that never seem heavy enough, faded dresses layered one atop another, even grain sacks pressed into service as makeshift blankets. The pile is a fortress of cloth, but it doesn't stop the ache in your bones. Cold on the frontier was not just something you felt, it lived inside you, settled into your marrow, and refused to leave. And you were not alone. Families learned quickly that winter survival demanded proximity, even if it meant surrendering comfort or privacy. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, all jammed together into one bed, limbs entangled, breaths mingling into a collective fog. On particularly brutal nights, chickens might be brought inside, their clucking muffled beneath the quilts. A dog might curl against your feet, its body heat a lifeline more precious than dignity. A cabin in winter was not a home, it was a lifeboat, and every living creature was part of the crew. The mattress beneath you crackles whenever someone shifts. It is stuffed with corn husks that have long since dried into brittle shards. Each husk pokes through the thin ticking, pricking skin through your clothes. The frame is made of ropes strung tight between wooden posts, sagging in the middle under the weight of so many bodies. You do not move unless you must, because each motion leaks warmth into the night. From the floor, your younger sister whispers, "Ma, the water bucket's frozen again." The words are barely audible, a fragile thread in the howling silence. "Shush, child," your mother murmurs back, voice thick with exhaustion. "We'll deal with it when there's light." You know she's right, but it doesn't matter. The bucket won't be any less frozen at dawn. Still, you stay quiet. Words are a luxury. Talking wastes warmth. This is the frontier winter reality that diaries and letters describe in haunted tones. The cold was not an inconvenience, it was the great equalizer, the ever-present spectre that measured every decision. The air itself could kill you. The short walk to the outhouse could kill you. Even your own sweat could betray you, soaking your clothes and then freezing solid, turning the heat of your body into a weapon against you. And people did die by the hundreds. Every winter, it is tempting to romanticize the frontier as a land of rugged individuals carving empires out of wilderness. But winter shattered that illusion with brutal efficiency. Frontier winter was a season of attrition. Every choice carried weight, every mistake exacted a price. Failed to gather enough fuel, and you froze. Failed to prepare food properly, and you starved. Failed to respect the weather, and you vanished into a whiteout storm. The margin for error was thinner than ice on a February creek. The most terrifying part was how easily the ordinary became deadly. A routine walk between the house and the barn could turn into a fight for survival if the wind picked up and snow began to fall. A trip to fetch water could leave you frostbitten if you lingered too long. Children playing outside for even a few minutes could return with blackened fingers or ears. The frontier demanded constant vigilance. Because the cold never rested, settlers quickly learned to sleep light, waking often to check the fire, to make sure embers still glowed in the stove or hearth. Losing the fire meant hours of misery, sometimes death if kindling was scarce. Fathers would rise in the night, stirring coals, feeding scraps of fuel, banking embers beneath ash so they would smolder until morning. Failure meant waking to a cold hearth, and no way to rekindle it, a small disaster that could spiral into catastrophe. And yet, for all its cruelty, winter also revealed the endurance of ordinary people. Diaries speak of children giggling beneath quilts, turning hardship into games. They describe mothers who stitched by the faint glow of lanterns, fingers numb but steady, determined to patch clothing for another week's wear. They recall fathers who trudged miles through snowdrifts for fuel, returning half-frozen but triumphant. Each act, however small, was an assertion. We are still here, and we will not yield. The settlers' resilience was not born of heroism in the cinematic sense. It was quieter, grittier. It was the courage to get up each morning, knowing the water bucket was frozen solid, the discipline to eat sparingly, to ration firewood, to endure discomfort without complaint, the humility to learn from neighbors, from native peoples, from anyone who knew a trick to outwit the cold. Survival was not glory, it was stubbornness, measured day by day. Picture yourself there, in that dim cabin. Frost feathers creep across the inside walls, turning rough-hewn boards into crystalline art. The wind outside screams like a living thing, battering the roof, searching for cracks. Your family lies pressed close, a tangle of limbs and blankets, your breath clouds in the faint light of dawn seeping through the window. A window rimmed with ice so thick it seems carved from stone. This is not comfort, it is not warmth, but it is life barely, precariously, but life all the same. And on the American frontier, that was victory enough. The morning began with the promise of spring. The date was January 12, 1888, and across Nebraska and the Dakota Territory, settlers woke to a world that felt strangely gentle. The air was mild, almost soft against the skin. Men stepped out of their sod houses, shrugging off heavy coats, surprised to find the prairie sun warming their backs. Children ran to school in little more than sweaters and light shawls, cheeks flushed, not from frost, but from excitement at the reprieve from winter's constant grip. Farmers hitched wagons without gloves, some even joking that perhaps the season was breaking early. But the frontier had a way of punishing hope. By noon, everything changed. First came the sound like a freight train bearing down across the plains, a low, rolling roar that made even the most seasoned farmers pause mid-step. Then the sky darkened. In a matter of minutes, the brilliant blue vanished behind a wall of grey-black cloud that advanced like an army. The wind struck next, fierce and unrelenting, carrying snow that didn't fall but flew sideways in blinding sheets. Temperatures plunged 40 degrees in as many minutes. This was the children's blizzard. For thousands of unsuspecting settlers, it arrived like a trap sprung from the sky. One of those caught in its grip was Minnie Freeman, a 19-year-old teacher in a one-room schoolhouse near Ord, Nebraska. She had 17 pupils that day, children ranging from 6 to 15. The storm struck with such violence that the roof of the schoolhouse was torn away, exposing the children to the howling winds. Snow poured in, carried by gusts so strong that doors rattled against their frames like they were being battered by fists. Minnie faced a choice no young woman should have had to make: stay inside a crumbling structure that offered no shelter, or lead her students into a storm that could kill them in minutes. She chose action. Tearing strips of rope, she tied the children together in a human chain, binding them to her like beads on a string. Then, shouting above the storm, she led them out into the white void. Visibility was near zero. The snow struck like needles, blinding eyes, freezing tears to cheeks. Small hands clutched the rope until their knuckles went numb. The group stumbled, crawled, and staggered forward, following Minnie's desperate memory of where a homestead might be. Minutes stretched into an eternity. For the children, each step was an act of faith. For Minnie, it was a gamble between life and death. They reached safety, most of them. Newspapers would later hail her as the fearless maid. Songs were written in her honor. She became the heroine of the blizzard, proof that courage could snatch life from the jaws of winter's cruelty. But Minnie's success story was an exception. Across the Great Plains, the blizzard claimed more than 235 lives, many of them children who had tried to walk home from school in light clothes. Some were found just yards from safety, frozen in positions that told heartbreaking stories. A brother who had wrapped his coat around his younger sister and curled himself around her small body, both dead. His final act, one of sacrifice. Groups of children huddled together in the snow, frozen mid-and parents who searched in vain until their own lives were claimed by the cold. Why were they caught off guard? Settlers knew storms existed. They had faced blizzards before, but this one struck with deception. That morning had been so warm that no one prepared. Coats were left at home. Food stores and stoves were unattended. Horses were sent into fields without blankets. The blizzard was not just deadly, it was treacherous, lulling its victims into complacency before springing its trap. The lesson was clear, written in grief and loss across the frozen prairie. Preparation was everything. On the frontier, families quickly learned that winter could not be negotiated with. It was not enough to hope, or to trust in luck, or to assume that tomorrow would be milder. The only thing that kept a household alive from November to April was the work they did before the first snow fell. By September, every member of a family, no matter how small, was pressed into service. Diaries from the 1880s described children as young as 5 trudging into fields with baskets, gathering fuel in anticipation of the long months ahead. Mothers sealed cracks in cabin walls with rags, mud, or straw, stuffing every gap where wind might sneak in. Fathers stacked hay, built windbreaks, reinforced roofs, and dug root cellars. "We never stopped working," remembered James Eastman, who grew up in Nebraska during the 1880s. From sunup to sundown, it was prepare, prepare, prepare. The anxiety of mothers was particularly acute. One diarist wrote of the look in her mother's eyes each autumn. She was counting supplies against days, wondering if we'd make it. It was a grim arithmetic that defined frontier life. Fuel was the first concern. On the open prairie, trees were scarce. Wood could not be relied upon. Instead, families turned to what the land offered: buffalo chips, dried cow dung, twisted grass, corn cobs, sunflower stalks. To Easterners, the idea was revolting. Burning animal waste in the family stove seemed barbaric. But on the plains, it was salvation. Buffalo chips burned hot and clean, with little smoke and almost no odor. A good fire of chips could keep a cabin just warm enough that water didn't freeze indoors, which was as close to comfort as most settlers came. Children often bore the brunt of fuel gathering. Sent out with baskets or wagons, they scoured fields for hours, picking up every fragment of dried dung. "I never thought I would be grateful for animal waste," wrote Sarah Hattersley in 1879, "but today I spent 6 hours gathering chips. My back is broken, my hands raw. The pile is good. It might see us through January if we are careful." Food was the second concern. The growing season was a race against time, and harvest was only half the battle. What mattered most was preservation. Families salted, smoked, dried, and pickled. Vegetables were buried in root cellars, meat turned into jerky, cabbage pounded into sauerkraut. Each jar sealed, each barrel filled, was another insurance policy against starvation. A family that entered winter unprepared was not a family. At Alit was a tragedy waiting to happen. The blizzards reinforced this truth. Settlers learned that weather could change in minutes. What looked like a manageable day could transform into a fight for survival before noon. And so, those who endured became obsessed with readiness. Enough food for 6 months, enough fuel for 8. walls packed tight against the wind, spare clothing at the ready. There was no such thing as too much preparation. Those who failed paid in flesh, fingers lost to frostbite, toes blackened beyond repair, entire families frozen in their cabins when fuel ran out. The stories of those deaths spread across the frontier, whispered like cautionary tales by neighbors who vowed not to repeat their mistakes. The children's blizzard became a symbol, not only of winter's cruelty, but of humanity's fragility in the face of nature. Its victims were mourned, but their suffering became a lesson for the living. To settle the frontier was to gamble with the cold, and the only way to survive was to prepare as though the worst storm in history might come tomorrow, because one day it would. On the American frontier, the line between life and death often glowed faintly in the iron belly of a potbelly stove. Its warmth was the beating heart of every homestead, but a stove was only as reliable as what you could feed it, and on the wide, treeless prairies of Nebraska, Dakota, and Minnesota, fuel was not just scarce, it was the most precious commodity a family could possess. Back east, wood was taken for granted. Whole forests stretched for miles, and every man knew the feel of an axe in his hands. But on the prairies, trees were absent. The horizon stretched unbroken, an ocean of grass, endless sky, and nothing tall enough to cut down. The land itself was a paradox, fertile enough to grow corn and wheat, but barren when it came to the simple need for firewood. The first thing that struck me about Nebraska, wrote English immigrant Thomas Farnham in 1876, was the terrible emptiness of it all. In Surrey, we had forests. Here, a man could die for want of a decent piece of firewood, so settlers turned to what the buffalo left behind. Buffalo, Chip's prairie gold. The massive herds of bison that once thundered across the plains left a different kind of legacy. Their droppings, sun-dried and hardened, they became the frontier's most important heating resource. Buffalo chips, stacked high beside cabins, were as valuable as gold in winter. At first, Easterners scoffed at the idea of burning dung. It felt degrading, barbaric. Caroline Peterson, who had moved from Boston, admitted she nearly left her husband the first time he hauled home a wagon piled high with buffalo waste. "I thought he had lost his mind," she wrote. "I wept to think we would live like savages." But by January, she was out with her children, gathering chips herself, grateful for every one she found. The miracle of buffalo chips was that they burned hot, steady, and surprisingly clean. The fibrous prairie grasses digested by the animals created compact, dense fuel that produced little smoke. One good-sized chip could burn nearly an hour. Settlers soon realized that without them, there was no surviving a Dakota winter. Children were often sent out to gather them. Imagine a 6-year-old trudging with a basket across frozen ground, hands numb, bending to scoop brittle brown patties from the snow. Families worked like ants, collecting thousands before the first snow buried them. Chip piles grew as tall as a man, stacked beside sod houses like fortresses of survival. By the 1880s, the buffalo were nearly gone, slaughtered by commercial hunters and government policies. Their chips remained scattered for years, a vanishing treasure. Families who lived on land where herds had once roamed counted themselves lucky. Those without had to adapt. Cow chips, grass, and desperation. As the bison disappeared, settlers turned to cow chips, less efficient but serviceable. Corn cobs, sunflower stalks, twisted bundles of prairie grassel became fuel. Anything that would catch a flame found its way into the stove. One family in Minnesota even developed a method of compressing hay into blocks, using a crude press to make them burn longer. German-Russian immigrants brought techniques from Europe, mixing manure and straw, trampling it with horses, cutting the mass into blocks, then drying them in the sun. These prairie bricks burned hotter and longer than plain dung. It was hard, filthy work. "Today, I spent 6 hours gathering chips," wrote Sarah Hattersley in 1879. "My back is broken, my hands raw, but the pile is good. It might see us through January if we are careful." That phrase, "if we are careful," haunted every family. Fuel was measured like treasure, counted daily, rationed with precision. Each morning began with calculations. How much to burn today? How much to save for tomorrow? The Aldrich family's ordeal story captures the desperation of fuel shortage better than that of the Aldrich family of South Dakota in the winter of 1881. They had gathered what they thought was enough stacks of buffalo chips, bundles of twisted hay, but by December, the pile was dwindling faster than expected. The nights grew longer, the cold deeper. Father calculated we had perhaps 2 weeks of fuel left, remembered Emma Aldrich, who was 12 at the time. We had been burning continuously just to keep the cabin above freezing. Mother cried that night after she thought we were asleep. I had never heard her cry before. The next morning, Charles Aldrich made a desperate decision. He would travel 15 miles to the nearest settlement to buy or borrow fuel. The journey was perilous temperatures. At 20 below, snow knee-deep, but staying meant certain death. He set out at dawn, their only horse pulling a small sled. His wife packed him salt pork hardtack and prayed. He did not return the next day, or the day after. 4 days passed. Inside the cabin, the Aldrich family burned the last of their buffalo chips. Then, one by one, they fed the furniture to the stove. First the table, then the chairs, finally, the bed slats themselves. On the 5th day, the fire sputtered to embers. The temperature inside dropped below freezing. Sarah Aldrich, desperate, told her daughter Emma and 7-year-old Thomas to go to their nearest neighbors, 3 miles away. She gave them strict instructions. Stay on the trail. If you get lost, you will die. If you get tired, you will die. Keep moving, no matter what. Emma carried her little brother on her back when his legs gave out. They stumbled for 2 hours through snowdrifts until, half frozen, they reached the Petersons' sod house. Emma's face was frostbitten. Thomas was barely conscious. The Petersons hitched a team immediately and raced to the Aldrich cabin, where they found Sarah curled around her infant son, both near death. They bundled them back to safety. Charles Aldrich returned 3 days later, gaunt and frostbitten himself. He had been trapped by a sudden blizzard and forced to shelter in a ravine for 2 nights. When he finally reached the settlement, he secured a sled load of wood and hauled it the 15 miles back. He arrived at his cabin to find it empty, cold as a tomb. Only by following tracks did he discover his family alive at the Petersons. The ordeal scarred them. Emma lost 3 fingers. Sarah's feet were permanently damaged, but they survived. And from that winter on, the Aldriches never underestimated fuel again. Every autumn they gathered enough for 2 winters, storing surplus not only for themselves, but to help neighbors in need. Fuel rationing and daily rituals, such stories were not uncommon. The environment offered no mercy. A single miscalculation meant frostbite or death. Families developed elaborate rationing systems. One boy recalled his mother's rules: 3 buffalo chips for breakfast, 2 for midday, 4 for supper. Never more. No matter how cold it got, banking the fire at night became a ritual of near religious significance. Fathers would carefully cover glowing embers with a layer of ash, insulating them so they smoldered until dawn. If done properly, a gentle puff of breath in the morning would coax the coals back to life. If not, the house woke to a dead stove and hours of misery trying to strike flame from frozen kindling. Some families heated stones in the stove, wrapped them in cloth, and placed them at the foot of beds. Others carried embers from house to barn in lidded pots, so animals could share in the fragile warmth. Every ounce of fuel was stretched, every technique borrowed or invented to squeeze 1 more hour of life from the flames. The ever-present fear-fuel anxiety gnawed at settlers like hunger. Even when stacks of chips or hay seemed high, there was always doubt. Would it last? Would a storm cut off access to neighbors or town? Would wet weather ruin carefully gathered piles? Mary Williams, recalling her Nebraska childhood, admitted, "I still dream about it." That constant worry, counting pieces of fuel like a miser counts gold, waking in the night to check the stove, terrified it had gone out, the terrible choice of whether to burn today or save for tomorrow. It haunted me. The frontier taught one brutal truth: fire was life, and on the open prairies, every ember was a victory snatched from the jaws of winter. On the frontier, your house wasn't just where you lived, it was your most important survival tool, and if it was poorly built, it was a coffin with windows. Settlers arriving from the east often built the kinds of houses they knew: clapboard cabins with neat wooden walls, large windows, and picturesque porches. They worked fine in Pennsylvania or Massachusetts, but on the Dakota plains, where winter winds screamed at 50 miles an hour and temperatures sank to 40 below, those houses might as well have been paper. Caroline Peterson remembered her first winter in such a cabin in 1879. "I could see daylight through the walls," she wrote. "The wind blew so hard it made the candle flames horizontal. We hung blankets on the walls and still nearly froze to death." By January, her family huddled in the kitchen, the only room they could keep above freezing. The lesson spread quickly: pretty houses killed. Survival demanded walls that could laugh at the wind, and so settlers embraced one of the most unlikely dwellings ever devised, the sod house. The sod house, ugly but indestructible picture, a home made not of wood, not of stone, but of earth itself. Settlers cut chunks of prairie turf, dense clay held together by a web of roots, into bricks 3 feet long and a foot wide. Each weighed 50 pounds. These bricks were stacked grass-side down, overlapping like masonry, roots intertwined to bind them into walls 2 to 3 feet thick. A good sod house, or soddy, could be thrown up in a week with enough help. In emergencies, desperate families built them in 3 days, racing against the first snow. They were damp, dark, and crawling with insects. Dirt crumbled constantly from the ceilings. When it rained, sod roofs leaked, and yet they saved lives. "Our soddy kept us alive," wrote Thomas Black in 1883, during the Great Blizzard. "Families in wooden houses froze to death, while we sat by our small fire, uncomfortably cool but nowhere near freezing." The sod house laughs at cold. It sneers at wind. The genius of sod houses lay in their thermal mass. Once warmed, those thick earth walls held heat like giant batteries. Even when the wind outside shrieked, inside temperatures stayed steady, not cozy by modern standards, but survivable. Designing for survival, successful families learned to design their sod homes with cunning. Doors were placed facing south, catching winter's sun and shielding against prevailing northwest winds. Entrances were doubled, a small vestibule forming a primitive airlock so gusts didn't rush in when the main door opened. Earth berms were piled against walls to cut drafts and keep foundations warm. Windows were few and small, sometimes covered with oiled paper instead of glass, minimizing heat loss. Inside, quilts were hung to partition the space, creating smaller rooms easier to heat. The stove was placed at the center, radiating warmth to sleeping areas clustered nearby. Mary Williams of Nebraska recalled, "On the coldest nights, we brought the chickens inside. They roosted on the foot of our bed. My husband complained, but I told him I'd rather have chicken droppings than frozen children." The Williams family went further. They built their animal shelter adjacent to their home. The shared wall absorbed heat from cows and horses, radiating it back into the human dwelling. The smell was suffocating, but the warmth was priceless. Lessons from the native settlers soon realized that survival meant unlearning their eastern ways and borrowing from those who had thrived here for centuries. The Lakota, Dakota, and other tribes had engineered homes perfectly adapted to the plains. The tipi, far from being primitive, was aerodynamic. The sloping walls guided wind around rather than against it. A central fire vented through the top while heat radiated evenly inside. Sleeping areas were placed strategically, warmest near the fire, coldest at the perimeter. Native knowledge of home orientation, windbreaks, and sun exposure astonished newcomers. Michael Harrison, a settler who married a Lakota woman, confessed, "I used to think Indian dwellings primitive, until I saw how perfectly suited they were. My wife laughed at our square houses that catch the wind like sails. White people build backward," she told me. Some settlers took the lesson to heart. They tucked homes against bluffs or stands of trees, natural shields against the wind. Others built earth berms, artificial hills piled against north walls. Every adaptation meant fewer cords of fuel burned, fewer fingers lost to frostbite. The price of mistakes, the cost of ignoring these lessons, was often fatal. The Jensen family, newcomers from Philadelphia in 1878, built an Eastern-style cabin with thin walls and wide windows. When the first Dakota blizzard struck, the wind punched like a living thing with malice. Thomas Jensen later wrote, "Snow flew sideways, filling every crack. The cabin's interior dropped to near freezing. Their food spoiled when moisture seeped in. By January, the family was boiling leather and trapping small animals to survive. They were saved only when a Lakota elder intervened, showing them how to reposition their entrance and build a window. We owe our lives to that man," Jensen admitted. Not all were so lucky. Many families who clung to Eastern designs simply perished. A poorly built house was not just uncomfortable, it was a death sentence. Innovation born of necessity over time. Frontier homes evolved into sophisticated survival systems. The Olson family of Dakota Territory, after nearly dying their first winter, rebuilt with ingenuity that would make modern green builders proud. They banked soil against the north wall, added a vestibule airlock, and oriented windows south for maximum winter sunlight. Every change we made was paid for in saved firewood, Eric Olson wrote, and saved firewood meant saved lives. Others experimented with underground dugouts, homes carved into hillsides, insulated by earth itself. These were dark and often damp, but in brutal storms, they stood firmer than anything above ground, and every successful innovation spread quickly. Frontier families shared ideas the way others shared recipes. Survival was communal knowledge, learned through trial, error, and tragedy. Living inside the sod walls, what was it like to live in such a home? Dim, cramped, and always tinged with the smell of earth. Frost often crept along the interior walls, sparkling in lantern light. Water dripped through sod roofs when snow melted, leaving puddles on packed dirt floors. Bugs were constant guests. Children sometimes woke to find beetles crawling across their quilts. And yet, those same children grew up alive because of it. Anna Johnson remembered her Minnesota sod house fondly. It was ugly as sin, but it kept us from freezing. I used to press my cheek against the wall and marvel that it wasn't cold to the touch, even when the wind howled outside. The frontier's harsh math on the prairie. Architecture was not about style. It was about survival. A sod house, with all its flaws, outperformed a beautiful clapboard home 10 times over when the temperature hit 40 below. Settlers learned quickly that pride had no place in winter. As one farmer put it bluntly to an eastern visitor, better to live with snakes in your walls than sleep in a coffin with shingles. The sod house was more than shelter. It was the frontier's first great adaptation, a testament to human ingenuity under duress. In its damp walls and musty air lay a singular truth. Survival belonged not to the prettiest house, but to the one that held firm when the prairie screamed. For every frontier family, fire was life. It boiled water, cooked meals, warmed freezing bones, and lit dark nights. But fire was also treacherous. A single mistake could turn salvation into death. On the open prairie, settlers quickly learned that the dangers inside their stoves and chimneys were nearly as deadly as the blizzards outside. The fragile flame every evening, the head of the household performed a ritual as important as prayer. He would bank the fire, carefully covering glowing coals with ash to preserve them until morning. Done properly, a breath at dawn could bring the embers roaring back to life. Done poorly, the family woke to a cold hearth and hours of misery trying to strike flame from frozen kindling. Emma Johnson recalled, "Father moved so slowly, as if he were a doctor performing surgery. Each coal had its place. He said a fire was like a child. You had to tend it gently or lose it. A dead stove wasn't just an inconvenience, it was disaster. Matches were scarce, kindling frozen, and fuel precious. Without fire, a cabin became a tomb in hours. Chimney fires, ablaze to fire, improvised. Stoves and crude chimneys brought their own dangers. Many settlers used stovepipes made of scrap iron or even hollowed logs. Poorly constructed chimneys allowed creosote highly flammable soot to build up. One spark and flames shot skyward. Families sometimes awoke to the roar of a chimney fire, sparks raining down onto sod roofs. In wooden cabins, disaster was even more certain. One Nebraska settler recalled, "We woke to the sound of fire in the pipe. Father beat at it with a wet rag on a pole. Mother carried out blankets and children, ready to abandon the house. By luck, the chimney held. Others weren't so fortunate. A fire on the prairie meant not just the loss of a house, but often the death of livestock, food, and hope. The silent killer, more insidious than fire, was smokehand, its deadly cousin, carbon monoxide. Potbelly stoves burned almost anything: dung, grass, hay, even rags. When fuel smoldered incompletely, it released poisonous gas, colorless, odorless, lethal. Carbon monoxide claimed countless lives. Families would go to sleep with their stove burning and never wake again. The Petersons were found in their beds, reported the Dakota Territory Gazette in February 1882. All 4 appeared peaceful, as if sleeping, but no life remained in them. Their stove, still warm when neighbors entered, had apparently malfunctioned, filling the home with deadly vapors. Stories like these spread terror across the prairie. Settlers had learned to fear the blizzard outside, but this was worse. A killer that slipped in silently while they slept. Primitive detectors' necessity bred invention. Some settlers adopted a grim but clever practice. They kept caged animals, mice, canaries, even sparrows, near their stoves. If the creature sickened or died, it was a warning: ventilate the house, or follow the Petersons. Michael Anderson remembered his father setting a cage of mice near the stove each winter. He said their lives were the price of ours. If they lay still too long, he'd throw open the door. No matter the storm outside, it was crude, but it saved lives. When smoke turned deadly even without carbon monoxide, smoke itself could kill. Chimneys clogged with snow during blizzards, forcing fumes back into cabins. Families had to choose: extinguish the fire and freeze, or breathe smoke and suffocate. The Miller family faced this choice in January 1885. Their sod house kept them sheltered during a storm locals later called the White Death. But when their chimney packed with snow, smoke filled the house. Robert Miller wrote, "We sat in darkness, wrapped in every blanket we owned. My wife held our baby inside her coat against her skin. The water in our bucket froze. We could not risk the fire, so we shivered in silence." They survived, but only barely. When Robert finally dug a trench through chest-deep snow to clear the chimney, his children's lips were blue and his wife was half conscious. He returned to the cabin looking like a snow creature himself, covered in frost, with 3 toes blackened from the cold. The Johnsons' narrow escape. Another family wasn't so fortunate. In 1879, the Johnsons of Minnesota nearly succumbed to smoke inhalation. Their chimney clogged during a blizzard. The mother woke coughing, barely able to breathe. She roused her husband and children, dragging them into the barn where livestock huddled. They spent the night pressed against cows for warmth, lungs still burning. "Had Anna not woken when she did," wrote Lars Johnson later, "we would all have passed in our sleep. The barn stank of manure, but it gave life." When dawn came, the family dug out their chimney with half-frozen fingers, swearing never to ignore smoke again. The desperation of fuel, the scarcity of fuel, only magnified these dangers. When chips and hay dwindled, families grew reckless, feeding stoves with anything that would burn wetwood, rags, even books. Poor fuel smoked badly, filling cabins with choking haze. Some settlers tore apart furniture, burning painted wood that released noxious fumes. Sarah Miller recalled the agony of burning her children's cradle during the winter of 1886. "It had held all our babies, but better to burn the cradle than bury a child." The smoke filled the cabin with a bitter stench, but the fire kept them alive. Community watch, so common, was stove-related. Tragedies that communities developed. Chimney watch systems. Neighbors checked each other's homes daily in winter. If smoke didn't rise from a chimney by mid-morning, they investigated. Thomas Peterson, writing of the winter of 1887, described, "Johnson and I split the north side of the settlement. We checked 23 homes each morning. If no smoke showed, we'd knock. If no answer came, we entered. One morning we found the Williams family unconscious from coal gas. Doctor said another hour would have been too late." This practice saved countless lives, a reminder that even in private matters like tending a stove, survival was a shared duty. The bitter irony: there was no greater irony on the frontier than this. The very fire that kept you alive might kill you. Too weak, and you froze. Too strong, and you burned. Smoldering, it poisoned you. Each night, families lay down with a kind of fear modern people can scarcely imagine. They prayed the embers would hold until morning, that smoke would vent properly, that the roof wouldn't catch. Mary Williams summed it up decades later. "Every morning we woke was a small miracle. The stove had not betrayed us, the cold had not beaten us, and so we lived another day." The unseen enemy in the end. Smoke and fumes taught settlers one of winter's harshest lessons. Survival was never guaranteed. No matter how well you prepared, you could gather chips, build a strong soddy, sew warm clothes, and still lose everything because of a clogged chimney or a poisoned room. But the settlers endured anyway, balancing on that knife edge between fire and frost. They did not forget the tragedies. The Petersons found peaceful but dead. The Millers nearly lost to smoke. The Johnsons coughing their way into the barn. These stories became warnings passed from family to family, like fire itself dangerous, but essential to keep alive. On the Dakota plains, stepping outside in January was like stepping into another world, one designed to kill you. The air crystallized in your lungs. Your eyelashes froze together. The wind didn't just blow. It punched, cutting through cloth as if it weren't there. In this frozen battlefield, your clothing wasn't an accessory. It was your only portable shelter. Eastern fashion meets prairie. Death. Most settlers arrived, dressed in the garments of the East. Cotton shirts, fine wool coats, leather boots polished for Sunday. These clothes worked well enough in Boston or Philadelphia. On the frontier, they became death traps. Margaret Wilson remembered the day her husband went to check livestock wearing his Philadelphia coat. He came back with arms frozen to the elbow. The doctor cut 3 fingers from his left hand, 2 from his right. That coat was fine for Vermont, she said bitterly, but useless here. The greatest culprit was cotton. In the East, cotton was breathable and comfortable, but in prairie cold, it was lethal. Cotton, once wet from sweat or snow, lost all insulating power. Worse, it drew heat away from the body as it dried. More than one man died with axe in hand, found frozen just yards from safety, his sweat-logged cotton shirt stiff as armor. Thomas Peterson described finding a neighbor that way. He was like a statue still on his feet, the axe over his shoulder, frozen right where he stood. His shirt was ice, his skin blue. The cold had reached his heart. The wisdom of layers, those who survived longest abandoned Eastern fashions and embraced layering. Native peoples and seasoned trappers taught them. 3 thin shirts trapped heat better than 1 thick one. Each layer created pockets of warm air, a buffer between skin and the killing wind. Michael Donovan recalled, "The old trapper told me 3 shirts beat 1 coat. Thought he was tried it anyway. Difference between night and day. Saved my hide that winter." Layers also offered adaptability. Sweating was dangerous. Wet garments froze fast. With layers, settlers could peel one off when working, then put it back when resting, avoiding the deadly chill that came when sweat-soaked clothing froze solid. The glory of wool if cotton was the killer. Wool was the savior. Wool kept up to 80% of its insulating power, even when soaked. A man who fell through river ice in wool garments might stagger home alive. In cotton, he'd die within the hour. Samuel Johnson proved it in 1885. He fell chest-deep into a frozen creek, dragged himself out, and walked home. His wool froze stiff, but his body stayed warm enough to survive. "I reached the door half encased in ice, but alive," he wrote. "Wool was my salvation." Every settler who lived long enough came to worship wool. Wool shirts, wool socks, wool blankets. The stuff was worth more than gold in January. Families guarded it fiercely, storing garments in cedar chests, patching every hole. Leather armor against the wind, wool insulated, but leather shielded. A good leather coat, properly treated with fat or tallow, blocked prairie gales. Boots required the same care. Stiff leather cracked in the cold, leaving feet exposed. Fathers spent evenings rubbing fat into boots, softening them until their hands glistened. "Stiff boots are dead boots," one settler told his children, and dead boots mean dead feet. Fur and moccasins. Lessons from the Lakota. The boldest shift came when settlers abandoned their cultural pride and copied native peoples. Rabbit fur mittens, moccasins lined with pelts, raccoon hats with tails dangling. To Eastern eyes, these looked savage. To survivors, they looked like life. William Foster admitted, "My fine Boston boots were like blocks of wood. Couldn't feel the ground. Couldn't tell if my feet were freezing." Switched to moccasins lined with rabbit fur. "Could feel everything. My toes stayed warm, even at 20 below." Not everyone accepted the lesson. One man, Henderson, refused to wear moccasins, sneering they were for engines. They found him in spring, frozen in a drift. His civilized boots still polished, but his feet black with rot. The survivors had swallowed their pride and adapted. Mittens versus gloves. Even small choices mattered. Gloves separated fingers, letting each freeze alone. Mittens kept fingers together, sharing warmth. John Peterson lost 2 fingers his first winter by insisting on gloves. "My wife told me I was a fool," he admitted. She was right. Never wore gloves again. Scarves, wraps, and the art of breath itself could freeze garments solid. Settlers learned to wrap scarves in careful layers that protected skin while allowing moisture to escape. Otherwise, face coverings iced over, turning to frozen masks that suffocated their wearers. Scarves overlapped layers of shirts and coats, preventing gaps where wind could enter. Every seam was considered. Every overlap mattered. A single crack in defenses could mean frostbite in minutes. Community clothing lessons. Veteran settlers didn't let newcomers die from ignorance if they could help it. Sarah Peterson recalled Johnson riding over the day the Miller family arrived in October with cotton coats and thin gloves. He brought 3 sheep worth of wool and a pile of rabbit skins. "Start sewing," he told them, "or start planning funerals." Some communities even held winter schools, evenings where experienced settlers taught clothing strategies, how to layer, how to waterproof boots, how to spot frostbite before it was too late. These sessions saved lives as surely as food banks and fuel piles. Dressing for the impossible, even the best clothing had limits. Below 30 below, most chores outside became impossible. Men timed trips to barns like soldiers on missions, 20 minutes dressing for 10 minutes work. Every movement was planned, every step rehearsed. Thomas Johnson remembered. Father counted the steps to the barn, knew exactly how long it took. Dressed for 20 minutes outside. If he lingered, he'd die. The culture of survival clothing over time. A distinctive frontier style emerged. Wool layers beneath leather coats, moccasins lined with fur, rabbitskin mittens, mittens hanging on cords around children's necks so they wouldn't be lost, raccoon hats with tails. What seemed ragged to Easterners was, in truth, highly engineered survival wear. Settlers stopped caring how they looked. Better to be mocked as a wild woman than buried as a fine lady. As Emma Johnson's mother put it, better to look a savage than be a dead Boston lady. By the mid-1880s, most frontier families wore hybrid garments, European fabrics mixed with native methods. It was adaptation written in wool, leather, and fur. The hard lesson, the truth was brutal. Those who clung to Eastern clothing rarely lived to see their second winter. Those who adapted survived. Settlers learned to see clothing not as fashion but as fortresses stitched by hand, armor against an enemy that attacked skin, lungs, and bone. Charles Wallace, who nearly froze in a blizzard before being saved by his layered wool and fur garments, became a community teacher. His advice was simple and unromantic. Dress as if you'll be sleeping in a snowbank, because one day you might. Food was the body's fire. No matter how thick your sod walls, or how carefully you banked your coals, without calories to fuel your furnace, the cold one. And on the frontier, there were no grocery stores, no resupply trips, no Amazon wagons rolling over the prairie. Whatever you had in your cellar by the first snow was all you would eat until spring. No second chances, no hidden reserves. That knowledge haunted every settler from the moment frost touched the fields. Mothers counted bushels with haunted eyes. Fathers stared at dwindling herds, calculating which animals could be slaughtered before feed ran out. Children gathered fuel, yes, but they also knew to guard against mice slipping into the cellar, because a single sack spoiled by vermin could tip a family from survival into starvation. Root cellars were the first line of defense. Dug 7 or 8 feet into the earth, they held steady temperatures just above freezing. Father said the devil himself couldn't freeze food that far underground. Emma Johnson remembered. Potatoes sat in barrels packed with sand. Carrots and beets lay in damp corners where humidity kept them from shriveling. Onions hung in braided strings, garlic tied into bunches above. Cabbages dangled upside down by their roots from beams overhead. Apples were segregated because their gases spoiled everything nearby. It wasn't neatness, it was science born of desperation. One misplacement, and rot spread like a disease through precious stores. Still, even the best-kept cellar ran down. By February, shelves that had been stacked high in October held gaps and empty barrels. Families stretched meals thinner, pretending not to notice the space widening between meals. We ate bark soup by March, recalled Caroline Peterson. Boiled tree bark with a handful of flour. It tasted like despair, but it kept us breathing. Preservation had to extend beyond cellars. Fermentation became a frontier medicine chest. Sauerkraut wasn't a luxury ate, was vitamin C insurance. Without it, scurvy set in, bleeding gums, reopening wounds, death. German immigrants insisted every household make barrels of kraut in autumn. Mothers shredded cabbage until their hands bled, salted it, pounded it into crocks. They checked daily for weeks, skimming mold, whispering prayers. A spoonful a day keeps scurvy away, said Hinrich Müller, not as a proverb, but as hard truth. Meat was another puzzle. A fresh kill in November meant feasting, yes, but unless preserved it was waste. Smokehouses glowed all autumn. Strips of venison or beef hung above fires until they dried into jerky. Salt barrels turned pork into pale, briny slabs that might last the winter if carefully rationed. It wasn't pleasant eating. Soaking was required to leach out the brine, and even then the flavor was harsh. But the alternative was hunger. One girl wrote of her father shaving slices thin as paper to stretch the barrel's contents. Another. Weak. Then there was pemmican, the strange, unlovely brick of survival food taught by native neighbors. Dried meat pounded to powder, mixed with rendered fat and berries, packed in rawhide. It looked like something you'd feed a dog. It tasted little better, but it carried 3,000 calories in a single pound, lasted years, and could save a family in a blizzard. The Johnsons of Nebraska survived the storm of 1857 on pemmican alone. Each child rationed a lump a day. It looked like tar, but it kept us alive. Their son wrote decades later, "Rationing was mathematics. Fathers kept ledgers, counting every pound and every week until spring. One week might see generous portions, the next, thin gruel. Rodents or mold could undo months of preparation. That constant gnawing worry," Mary Williams remembered, counting potatoes like a miser counts gold, waking at night to check the stove and the cellar, deciding whether to eat today or save for tomorrow. Sometimes tomorrow never came for neighbors less prepared. Families starved, not in the dramatic collapse of famine, but in the slow erosion of strength. First hunger, then weakness, then confusion. Children grew thin, old people wasted away. Mothers gave up their portions so little ones could eat. "By spring my mother could not stand," Sarah Johnson wrote. "She had lived on broth for months. She saved us with her body. And when supplies ran out completely, settlers turned to desperate measures. Bark stripped from trees, lichens scraped from rocks, pine needles boiled into weak teas for vitamins, ice fishing in February, men chopping holes through 3 feet of ice with homemade chisels, praying for a bite before fingers went numb." One father returned after 14 hours on the frozen lake, with 47 fish piled on his sled, his children's lives saved by his frozen persistence. But the frontier's greatest weapon against starvation wasn't ingenuity or storage. It was community. Neighbors shared when others faltered. Settlements established common pantries. Every family contributed a portion of their stores, and those in need could draw from it without shame, repaying when they could. The Nortons' root cellar flooded in November 1885. They lost most of their potatoes and all their carrots. That winter should have killed them. Instead, they borrowed from the common pantry and survived, repaying double over the next 3 years. Specialization flourished. Germans made kraut, Swedes dried fish, English wives canned jams. Families traded until winter diets were more varied than any household could achieve alone. Communal meals each Sunday kept spirits alive and bellies just full enough, even when it was only potato soup. Caroline Peterson wrote, "We came together and remembered we were not alone. Hunger haunted every winter, but it also forged bonds of steel. The family that hoarded alone often perished. The families that shared scraped through together. And when spring finally broke and green shoots pushed through thawing earth, survivors wept with gratitude, not just for food, but for the neighbors who had carried them through." Food on the frontier was never just about eating. It was survival, science, and solidarity. The fire inside to match the fire in the stove. Alone, a settler was as good as dead. That truth came slowly, often fatally. 2 men who clung too tightly to independence. William Evans, for example, settled in Dakota Territory in 1879, 15 miles from the nearest family. He was no fool. He'd lived in the Rockies, hunted game, wintered alone in the mountains. He told neighbors he didn't need anyone. When April came, they found him in bed, dead since January. Food untouched, fuel stacked neatly, his diary ending mid. The doctor said he likely just gave up, his mind broken by the silence and the cold. Isolation was poison. The mind starved for company as much as the body starved for food. Cabin fever wasn't a joke, it was a death sentence. The mind needs company like the body needs bread, wrote Dr. Henderson in 1883. "I have seen strong men waste away when left too long without another soul to speak to." That's why communities developed systems of survival far beyond what any one family could manage. Settlements made winter rules. No chimney left unwatched, no path left unshoveled, no neighbor left unchecked. Thomas Peterson remembered dividing duties with Johnson in 1887. Every morning before sunup, we checked for smoke at every chimney. If we saw none, we knocked. If no answer, we went in. More than once we found families half dead with smoke or cold. Paths between homes. Wells, barns cleared not by one man but by all. If someone fell ill, others took his paths. Snowdrifts could bury a cabin in a night. A network of trails meant no one disappeared completely beneath the white. Fuel too was shared. Communities built what they called last resort piles. Each family contributed a percentage of wood, chips, or hay. It wasn't charity. it was insurance. Anyone could draw from it, with the promise of paying back double next year. When storms broke houses apart, those same houses were dismantled deliberately, lumber salvaged to keep stoves burning. Pride bowed before survival. Better to lose a door or wall than a child. The winter of 1880 to 81, the hard winter, proved this truth. In Brookings, South Dakota, 23 families faced death as their fuel ran low. They made a collective choice: crowd into the 7 sturdiest houses, dismantle the others for fuel. Mrs. Anderson wept as men took her front door from its hinges, but she agreed it was life or death. Families packed shoulder to shoulder, 17 in a single house. Privacy vanished, tempers flared, the air grew thick with breath and bodies, but no one froze. Come spring, all 23 families walked out alive. Food was shared the same way. A common pantry kept in a church cellar fed families struck by disaster. The Nortons lost their entire harvest to a flood, but neighbors ensured they survived. In return, the Nortons contributed double for 3 years running, an unspoken contract of trust. And then there were the gatherings, the antidote to despair. Every Sunday, no matter how thin the soup or how brutal the wind, families crowded into a cabin or schoolhouse. They sang, told stories, traded news, reminded themselves they were not alone in the darkness. The laughter of children on Sunday saved my father from despair. One settler later confessed, even grief was shared. After the children's blizzard of 1888, when scores of children froze trying to reach home, neighbors dug graves, paid funeral costs, and took in orphans without question. Margaret Hanson, who lost her daughter Sophie, later wrote, "For 6 weeks, neighbor women came daily. They fed my surviving children, kept our fire alive. Their hands did what mine could not, while grief consumed me." Out of such tragedies grew traditions of watchfulness, cooperation, and resilience. Communities established winter schools, where old settlers taught newcomers how to bank a fire, sew rabbit-skin mittens, or spot frostbite. They organized visiting rotations to ensure no family went too long without human contact. They created mutual aid societies that later grew into town councils, fire brigades, and churches that served body as much as soul. What winter stripped away was pride. Bankers shoveled snow beside day laborers. A doctor's wife mended a farmer's coat. A farmer's wife nursed the banker's infant. Winter cared nothing for class. Its scythe cut rich and poor alike, and only collective labor blunted its edge. James Peterson summed it up simply: our winter rule was this: no one freezes, no one starves, no one faces the dark alone. Everything else could be argued in spring. That was the true legacy of frontier winters, not just sod houses, buffalo chips, or pemmican. It was the discovery that rugged individualism, so prized in the myth of the West, was no match for 40 below. Survival required humility, cooperation, and the willingness to see neighbors not as strangers but as kin. When settlers rebuilt after the hard winter, they built more than homes. They built systems of trust and interdependence that outlasted the storms. Volunteer fire brigades grew from chimney watch patrols. Councils grew from emergency committees. Churches expanded from Sunday hymns to winter pantries. By the turn of the century, electricity, telephones, and railroads had softened winter's bite. Yet the old lessons endured. "We have lights now," Emma Johnson wrote in 1922, "but when a blizzard comes, we still check our neighbors." Some lessons you do not unlearn, and that may be the greatest inheritance of those frozen settlers. The reminder that when storms close in and the night feels endless, the one true fire is the one you share with others. Spring came like a miracle on the prairie. One morning the horizon still lay under a white wall of snow, and then, a week later, green shoots pressed through. Families stumbled outside, eyes stinging from months of dim candlelight, to touch grass as if it were gold. Women cried openly in fields. Men knelt with trembling hands in thawed soil. Children ran barefoot in puddles, laughing at the mud that stained their feet. But the joy was always tempered by the roll call of absence. Neighbors missing, cabins abandoned, fresh graves on windswept hillsides. Survival was never universal. It was a lottery weighted by preparation, luck, and the mercy of community. Some mornings, as one woman put it, I could not believe we made it. Some mornings, I could not believe they did not. Those who lived carried scars, missing toes, frostbitten fingers, faces weathered by wind that felt like blades. They also carried knowledge carved as deeply as frost carves. Stone, knowledge of what burned and what did not, what foods could stretch, what clothing kept the blood flowing, how to bank coals so they smoldered until dawn, how to carve a snow cave in minutes when a blizzard swallowed the world, and above all, they carried the truth that no man, no family, no homestead survived alone. Pride and isolation had killed too many. Cooperation had saved the rest. From those frozen months emerged systems that shaped frontier society long after the sod houses melted back into earth. Volunteer fire brigades were born from chimney patrols. Town councils grew from the winter committees that rationed food and fuel. Churches became more than sanctuaries of prayer. They became centers of social welfare, storing grain and preserving the memory of solidarity. Historian Patricia Reynolds, writing in 1903, put it best: winter stripped away all pretense. Banker and farmhand, doctor and seamstress, stood side by side against the storm. Cold was the great equalizer, and community the only defense. Even decades later, when railroads brought coal, when telephones rang across plains, when electricity hummed in wires, the instinct endured. People still checked neighbors' chimneys after blizzards. Families still gathered for Sunday meals in January. The memory of hunger and frost had burrowed too deep to fade. What frontier settlers left us wasn't just towns and farms. They left us a blueprint of resilience. They proved that survival is rarely about the strongest individual. It's about the group, the fragile web of connections that turns loneliness into companionship, despair into endurance, scarcity into shared survival. It's tempting, lying in our perfectly heated homes, to think their world is distant, their struggles irrelevant, but their lessons are not relics. When disaster strikes, whether storm, famine, or hardship, is not the isolated who endure, but the link, not the proud hoarder, but the quiet neighbor who shares, not the loud individualist, but the humble collective. There was a saying whispered in Dakota Territory after the hard winter: "A lone settler is a dead settler." It was cruel but true, and in it lies the reminder that endures beyond prairie blizzards, beyond sod walls and buffalo chip fires. We survive together, or we don't survive at all. So when you lie tonight in your warm bed, wrapped in blankets that never run out, food waiting in the kitchen, heat flickering at the turn of a switch, think back to those families who endured months without warmth, light, or certainty. Remember how many fingers were lost to frostbite so that lessons about wool and mittens could be learned. Remember how many children starved so that communities built pantries and food banks. Remember how many houses fell to storms so that towns could rise, bound together by memory. Their story is not only history, it is instruction. It tells us that resilience is built not of walls or coats or barrels of food, but of hands held out in the dark, neighbors who will not let each other slip beneath the snow. The fire burns low now in that imaginary cabin on the plains. Outside, the wind howls, but inside, the family is not alone. Next door, another fire burns, and another beyond that. A chain of warmth, invisible but unbreakable. That is the true legacy of the frontier winter. Not merely endurance, but endurance shared. And as long as we remember that, their wisdom has not been lost.